Concrete drips with cold Atlantic moisture inside the U-boat command bunker at Loria. It is early 1943. Dawn hasn't fully broken, but the dim yellow lamps cast long shadows across stacked reports, plotted maps, and the steel columns that tremble with every distant explosion at the harbor. Admiral Karl Donitz stands over a fresh intelligence summary delivered from Berlin. Numbers so large he reads them twice. Liberty ships launched in a single month, more than the tonnages U-boats had sunk. Outside, the muffled groan of a damaged Type 7 being dragged into dry dock reminds him of the attrition he is now fighting. Behind him, staff officers whisper, unsure whether the figures are exaggerated. But the math refuses to change. America's shipyards were expanding at a pace beyond anything the Kriegsmarine had anticipated. Ships that once took months were now rolling off assembly lines weekly, sometimes daily. A thought settles heavily across the room. If this trend continued, Germany would lose the Battle of the Atlantic not in the ocean, but in the factories thousands of miles away. And to understand how this turning point emerged, we must step back to the world the U-boats once commanded with terrifying freedom. In the opening months of 1942, the Atlantic belonged to the U-boats. The Kriegsmarine called it the Second Happy Time, a period when German submarines prowled the eastern seaboard of the United States with near impunity. America had entered the war only weeks earlier, and its coastal defenses were unprepared for the scale and aggression of the submarine campaign now unfolding offshore. City skylines along the East Coast continued to glow brightly at night. Naively, almost defiantly, silhouetting merchant ships for German periscopes like targets in a shooting gallery. U-boat captains were stunned at how easy it was. Torpedoes ran true. Ships burned against illuminated horizons. Radio operators logged sinking after sinking until their pencils wore down. By February 1942, the situation had become catastrophic. German submarines ranged from North Carolina to Newfoundland, sinking tankers, freighters, and troop transports at a pace that stunned the world. At one point, U-boats destroyed more than 600,000 tons of Allied shipping in a single month. For the Kriegsmarine, it appeared that the strategy of starving Britain and isolating the Soviet Union through maritime strangulation was finally within reach. For the United States, the shock was immediate and profound. American naval forces had been built to project power across oceans, not to guard every mile of their own coastline. Escort vessels were limited. Air patrols were thin. Convoy systems had not yet been fully implemented. The U-boat offensive exploited every gap, every delay, every assumption that the Atlantic could wait while America mobilized for war. By spring 1942, shipping losses were unsustainable. Britain's lifeline narrowed to a thread. Essential war materials, food, oil, steel, vehicles, ammunition, were slipping to the bottom of the Atlantic faster than they could be replaced. British leaders warned Washington, without ships, there would be no invasion, no supply lines, no hope of defeating the Axis. The crisis exposed another truth. America did not yet possess a merchant fleet large enough to sustain a global war. Years of Depression-era budgets had left shipbuilding capacity modest and outdated. The United States Maritime Commission had plans for expansion, but those plans were designed for a gradual buildup, not the emergency conditions now unfolding. U-boat commanders, emboldened by their early success, believed they could maintain this pressure indefinitely. Their assessments assumed that America's industrial response would be slow, bureaucratic, and limited by traditional shipyard methods. Every German naval staff report repeated the same calculation. Germany could sink ships faster than the Allies could build them. It had been true so far. But below the surface of American industry, something unprecedented was beginning. In 1941, even before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. government had quietly turned to industrial pioneer Henry J. Kaiser, a man with no previous shipbuilding experience but a revolutionary understanding of large-scale construction. The Maritime Commission handed him an audacious mandate: create an emergency shipbuilding program capable of overwhelming any rate of maritime loss. Kaiser's philosophy was simple: break shipbuilding into components. Standardize everything. Build ships like automobiles, fast, interchangeable, and at enormous scale. Most traditional shipbuilders dismissed the idea as impossible. Liberty ships, the model chosen for mass production, were simple cargo vessels, slow, welded rather than riveted, and designed for utility, not beauty. But their real purpose was not elegance. It was volume. In early 1942, while U-boats still hunted along American shores, Kaiser's shipyards from Oregon to California to the Gulf Coast were laying down dozens of Liberty ships simultaneously. The first attempts were slow, clumsy, chaotic, but each week the process tightened. Welding teams practiced around the clock. Prefabricated sections moved on rails. New workers, men and women, trained in weeks rather than years, filled the yards. By mid-1942, America was already building ships at a rate that startled German analysts. But these early numbers were only the beginning. For the moment, however, the U-boats still believed they were winning. Sinkings remained high. Convoy escorts remained insufficient. And every new Liberty ship launch seemed too slow, too basic, too vulnerable to shift the balance. But what the Kriegsmarine did not yet understand was that American industry was accelerating into a phase the world had never seen, an industrial hurricane gathering speed with each passing month, a storm that would soon collide directly with Germany's most prized naval weapon. The turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic did not begin on the ocean. It began in American shipyards, places that, until the early 1940s, had never built ships at the speed demanded by global war. But under the United States Maritime Commission, a transformation unfolded that the German Naval Command had not imagined possible. The Liberty ship became the backbone of this revolution. Designated EC-2C1, it was a simple cargo vessel, long, steel-sided, powered by a triple expansion steam engine, and built for reliability over glamour. It carried about 9,000 tons of cargo, enough to keep Britain fed, armed, and alive. But its greatest advantage wasn't in its performance. It was in its manufacturability. America approached shipbuilding the way it approached automobiles and airplanes. Break down the problem. Standardize the solution. Build thousands. Henry Kaiser's shipyards led the charge. He introduced mass production methods never before used in maritime construction. Prefabricated sections of hulls, decks, and superstructures were welded together rather than riveted, saving enormous time. Enormous gantry cranes moved completed modules like puzzle pieces. Welders worked in rotating shifts, filling the night sky with showers of sparks. New workers arrived by the thousands. Many had never seen the ocean before. Women stepped into engineering and welding roles once dismissed as exclusively male. Migrants traveled from rural towns to industrial hubs. Training programs taught complex skills in weeks. By the end of 1942, some yards had workforces larger than entire pre-war U.S. armies. The results were staggering. A Liberty ship that once took 230 days to build was soon being completed in less than 50. Then 30. Then under 20 in some yards. The record would come later. A ship built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes at the Richmond shipyard. An achievement designed more for morale than practicality, but one that sent a shock through German intelligence circles. For every ship the U-boats sent to the bottom, America was launching multiple replacements. German reports struggled to adjust. Intelligence analysts recalculated American industrial capacity again and again, trying to reconcile the numbers. Traditional naval logic insisted that shipbuilding was slow. Skilled labor took years to train. Facilities were limited. Raw materials bottlenecked production. But these old assumptions no longer held. America was no longer building ships one at a time. It was building shipyards that built ships, factories of steel and fire that operated around the clock. By late 1942, the U.S. Maritime Commission oversaw dozens of shipyards, more than 600 ways, building slips, hundreds of thousands of workers. Every week, new facilities opened. Every month, output increased. And because the Liberty ship used standardized components, parts could be manufactured in inland factories and shipped by rail to coastal yards, turning the entire American industrial landscape into a vast supply machine. On the other side of the Atlantic, the U-boats were beginning to feel pressure. The Kriegsmarine had entered the war with limited submarine building capacity. German shipyards, constrained by bombing, shortages, and political interference, struggled to match the pace required for sustained attrition warfare. Type 7 submarines took months to construct and required skilled labor that Germany could not expand quickly. Even as U-boat captains achieved victories at sea, they increasingly fought an industrial war they could not win. By the end of 1942, merchant ship losses remained heavy but no longer catastrophic. Convoys tightened. Escort carriers expanded air coverage. Radar and sonar improved. Wolfpack attacks still inflicted damage, but the balance was shifting. The German Naval Command began receiving reports that defied their calculations. America was now launching more shipping tonnage each month than Germany had sunk. Dönitz, once confident that U-boats could strangle the Allied war effort, recognized the danger immediately. He had hoped that industry alone would not determine the Battle of the Atlantic. But the numbers spoke with brutal clarity. America was climbing a production curve no nation had ever attempted, and Germany, despite its tactical successes at sea, was increasingly unable to slow it. The clash between U-boat wolfpacks and Liberty ship convoys was no longer a simple contest of torpedoes versus steel hulls. It was a race of output versus attrition, a race that would soon reveal its decisive turning point. When Germany assessed American naval strength before 1941, it calculated shipbuilding output using pre-war numbers, figures derived from a modest industrial baseline. But those assumptions ignored a fundamental American advantage: the ability to convert civilian industry into wartime production on a scale no nation had ever attempted. America's manufacturing muscle had been forged in the automotive boom of the 1920s and tempered by the economic desperation of the Depression. Assembly lines, precision tooling, and mass production were deeply ingrained in U.S. industrial culture. When war arrived, these methods adapted with stunning speed. Detroit automakers shifted from producing cars to engines, aircraft, and ship components. Steel mills operated continuously, feeding coastal shipyards with prefabricated sections. Railroads moved materials in coordinated waves, turning inland factories into extensions of shipbuilding yards. The entire manufacturing landscape became an interconnected war machine. While Germany relied on limited, traditional shipyards and long-trained craftsmen, America relied on systems that multiplied labor, standardized production, and removed bottlenecks. It wasn't that America had more skilled shipbuilders. It had more ways to make shipbuilding Astra's predictable star. German commanders underestimated this difference. They viewed shipbuilding through the lens of naval tradition. America viewed it through the lens of mass production, and that philosophical divide became one of the war's most decisive factors. Angle 2, the technological angle. Standardization becomes a strategy. The Liberty ship's design was not revolutionary in performance, but it was revolutionary in intent. Everything about it served a single purpose: rapid duplication. Its welded hull eliminated the need for time-consuming riveting. Its parts were deliberately simple, allowing factories with no maritime experience to manufacture components. Every Liberty ship was essentially the same. If one sank, another could replace it almost immediately. In traditional shipyards, custom engineering slowed construction. In American emergency yards, the ship became modular. Bow sections, stern assemblies, and midship modules were built separately and fused together like industrial building blocks. This meant different yards could work on the same ship simultaneously. Workers no longer required years of specialized training. Repairs became faster because parts were interchangeable. By 1943, some Liberty ships contained components built in over 30 states, transported across the country by rail. German intelligence knew the ships were being built quickly, but reports struggled to explain how. They lacked the conceptual framework to understand a production model that treated naval vessels like mass-produced consumer goods. To the Kriegsmarine, a ship was a handcrafted instrument. To the Americans, a ship was an output metric. This technological shift, simple design, modular assembly, welded construction, turned the Liberty ship into the most strategically influential cargo vessel in history. Angle 3. The German intelligence angle. Misunderstanding the American engine. German naval intelligence operated with limited data and deeply rooted assumptions about industrial warfare. Early war estimates claimed the United States would require years to ramp up meaningful production. These assumptions were reinforced by Germany's own struggles. Resource shortages, bombed infrastructure, and long lead times for submarine construction. When intelligence reports began indicating that America was launching dozens of Liberty ships each month, analysts believed the numbers were inflated. One 1942 assessment insisted the figures were propaganda. Another assumed they referred to small coastal vessels rather than ocean-going freighters. Only by late 1942 did German command begin to understand the truth. The United States had mobilized its civilian labor force with unprecedented speed, creating a manufacturing surge that violated every German expectation. BDU, U-Boat Command, logs from the winter of 1942 to 43 reveal growing anxiety. Some officers questioned whether the Battle of the Atlantic could still be won through attrition alone. Others urged increased submarine production, recommendations that were impossible to fulfill given Germany's limited industrial base. The German miscalculation was not simply numerical. It was philosophical. They believed warfare would be decided by tactics, skill, and experience. America believed warfare would be decided by logistics, industry, and replacement capacity. The German commanders were not wrong about the importance of combat skill, but they failed to predict the overwhelming force of a nation capable of manufacturing more ships than they could sink. This misunderstanding formed the foundation of the turning point that was now approaching. While German officers studied tonnage charts and sinking reports, the real power of American shipbuilding came from a force they never fully accounted for. Ordinary people, many of whom had never worked near water, let alone built a ship. Across the United States, civilians stepped into wartime industry with a determination that reshaped the nation. Women filled welding lines, riveting stations, crane operations, and assembly teams. Migrants from the Dust Bowl arrived in coastal cities seeking work and stability. African American workers, often excluded from skilled labor, entered the shipyards in growing numbers, pushing through resistance and discrimination to contribute directly to the war effort. These were not traditional shipwrights. They were teachers, farmers, clerks, mechanics, homemakers, trained rapidly through streamlined programs and deployed into tasks once considered the domain of experts. The human energy inside Kaiser yards was relentless. Night shifts glowed with sparks from welded seams. Early morning crews lined up before dawn. Productivity boards displayed weekly goals. Newspapers published photographs of newly built ships sliding into the water, thanking the workers by name. Morale surged. Production soared. Every Liberty ship launched was not merely a vessel. It was a visible symbol of national unity and sacrifice. This human dimension frustrated German analysts. Their models had predicted industrial output, but not the emotional mobilization behind it. They assumed labor shortages, strikes, and training delays would restrict American capacity. Instead, shipyards saw record attendance, minimal stoppages, and a fierce sense of purpose. In the Battle of the Atlantic, the workers themselves became an unrecognized strategic force, one that no torpedo could reach. Angle 5, the operational angle. How convoys and escorts turn numbers into advantage. Industrial output alone could not win the Atlantic. Ships had to survive long enough to deliver cargo. Early in 1942, U-boats found isolated freighters easy prey. But the adoption of the convoy system, refined by British experience, reshaped the battlefield. Merchant ships no longer sailed alone. They moved in coordinated groups protected by destroyers, corvettes, escort carriers, and aircraft equipped with sonar, ASTIC, radar, and depth charge systems. As production soared, America could now afford to assign escorts to convoys in numbers previously impossible. The introduction of escort carriers, small aircraft carriers built on merchant hulls, extended air cover far into the mid-Atlantic, a zone once dominated by U-boats. Maritime patrol aircraft like the B-24 Liberator closed remaining gaps. German wolfpack tactics, once the terror of the seas, became increasingly dangerous to the submarines themselves. Improved radar allowed escorts to detect surfaced U-boats before they struck. New HF/DF radio direction finding equipment pinpointed U-boat communications. Longer-range aircraft forced submarines to remain submerged during the day, limiting speed and battery life. The operational picture shifted dramatically. More ships were launched. More ships survived. More U-boats were detected and destroyed. U-boat commanders reported that convoy escorts had become aggressive, persistent, and well-coordinated. What had once been a battlefield favoring stealth and surprise now favored detection and counterattack. Industry provided numbers. Operations provided survivability. Together, they overwhelmed Germany's capacity for attrition. Angle 6, the strategic angle. Germany misjudges the nature of industrial war. The final angle reveals the core strategic error that shaped Germany's defeat in the Atlantic, an underestimation of America's ability to wage industrial war. Germany approached naval warfare through the lens of traditional strategy, superior tactics, experienced crews, and calculated attrition. Its submarine fleet, though deadly, was always meant to be small and elite. The Kriegsmarine leadership assumed that victory at sea would depend on the ratio of ships sunk to submarines lost. America approached the war differently. It recognized that victory would depend not just on destroying the enemy, but on outproducing them. German leadership expected bottlenecks in U.S. steel production, labor shortages, and bureaucratic delays. Instead, the U.S. government centralized shipbuilding authority under the Maritime Commission, granted emergency powers, and coordinated raw materials, training, and logistics at a national scale. The strategic consequences were immense. Germany could not build submarines fast enough. Germany could not replace trained crews quickly enough. Germany could not protect its own shipyards from Allied bombing. And Germany could not stop the flood of new Allied tonnage reaching Britain and the Soviet Union. By late 1942 and early 1943, German commanders saw the truth. They were fighting a nation whose industrial capacity dwarfed theirs by magnitudes. Even if every U-boat performed flawlessly, the mathematics of war had turned decisively against them. This strategic miscalculation set the stage for the climax now approaching. the moment when the Battle of the Atlantic would shift irreversibly. By early 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached a breaking point. For 2 years, German U-boats had stalked Allied shipping lanes with devastating results. But now, in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, the balance of power was shifting, and this time decisively. The first sign did not appear in a dramatic battle, but on paper. BDU, U-Boat High Command, logs from January and February 1943 began recording troubling patterns. More submarines were being lost per patrol, fewer convoys were breaking apart, and wolfpack formations were increasingly disrupted by long-range aircraft that should not have reached them. Allied forces were closing the air gap. Radar detection had improved. Escort groups were more aggressive and better coordinated. Meanwhile, American shipyards were launching merchant vessels at a rate the Kriegsmarine could no longer comprehend. In some months, over 140 Liberty ships slid into the Atlantic. German losses in the same period often hovered around 75 to 100 ships sunk, meaning the Allies were gaining ground even before counting escorts, tankers, or troop ships. For the first time, German commanders faced a terrifying realization. They were losing the numbers game. At sea, the turning point crystallized in a series of battles during March and April 1943, weeks that historians now identify as the decisive moment when the U-boat threat was permanently blunted. Convoys like SC-122 and HX-229 initially suffered losses, but the wolfpacks attacking them paid a new and unexpected price. Escort groups pursued submarines relentlessly. Hedgehog mortars and improved depth charge patterns inflicted catastrophic damage on U-boats attempting to close in. At the same time, Allied codebreakers at Bletchley Park regained the ability to read German naval communications after deciphering updates to Enigma procedures. Wolfpack routes, once deadly surprises, were now anticipated. Convoys were rerouted around danger before U-boats ever sighted them. One event in particular symbolized this shift. In May 1943, a month later known to the Kriegsmarine as Black May, the Germans lost 41 U-boats in a single month, nearly a quarter of their operational fleet. Losses at this scale were unsustainable. For every submarine destroyed, Germany lost a train crew that could not be replaced quickly, months of construction time, precious resources diverted from other wartime needs. And all the while, Allied shipyards continued pushing new hulls into the water. The contrast was stark. Germany could build maybe 20 to 25 submarines a month at maximum surge. America could build that many merchant ships in a week. Donitz reviewed the reports while standing in the same bunker where he had once celebrated the U-boats' happy times. Now the tone was different, quiet, heavy, even resigned. His commanders submitted statistics that no longer promised victory through attrition. Allied convoys were surviving. U-boats were dying, and the flow of supplies toward Britain, North Africa, and later toward preparations for future invasions had become unstoppable. The ocean itself seemed to turn hostile to the U-boats. Radar-equipped aircraft hunted them day and night. Escort carriers patrolled waters once beyond the reach of air power. Even surfacing to recharge batteries became dangerous. Every factor that once favored the German submarines was eroding. But the most decisive force remained the one Donitz could not counter. American shipyards were simply outproducing German torpedoes. A Liberty ship sunk today could be replaced in 20 days. A U-boat sunk today could not be replaced for half a year, if ever. The Kriegsmarine's strategic assumption that sinkings would always outpace Allied construction collapsed completely. The commanders understood what the numbers meant, even if they struggled to accept it. The industrial war had been lost, and with it, the ability to starve Britain into submission. As May 1943 closed, Donitz issued a rare and sobering directive. U-boats were to withdraw temporarily from the North Atlantic. It was an admission that the wolfpacks could no longer operate there without unsustainable losses. The once invincible U-boat arm was finally and irrevocably on the defensive. And yet, the climax was not fully complete. The implications of this shift, both operationally and psychologically, still had to unfold inside Germany's naval command and across the wider Allied war effort. The second half of the climax would reveal how the defeat became permanent, how Germany recognized, too late, the true cost of underestimating American industry. The withdrawal of U-boats from the North Atlantic in late May 1943 did not mark the end of the submarine campaign, but it marked something more important: the end of German hopes that submarines could win the war. The wolfpacks were not merely regrouping. They were retreating from a battlefield that no longer favored them. In Berlin, the tone of reports reaching naval headquarters had shifted from urgency to inevitability. Losses in May were unprecedented, but the trends driving those losses had been building for months. German commanders now confronted a strategic reality they had long dismissed. The United States was producing merchant ships, escorts, and aircraft at a pace no U-boat fleet could match. It became clear that the Battle of the Atlantic was no longer a tactical contest. It had become a logistical war of endurance, one decided by steel, labor, and shipyard efficiency rather than torpedo accuracy. A single comparison highlighted this brutal truth. In April 1943, the Allies lost approximately 56 ships to U-boat attacks. During the same period, American shipyards launched over 120 new vessels, more than double the losses. Even if every U-boat in the Atlantic had achieved perfect results, the mathematics of output were catastrophic for Germany. The Allies were gaining ships faster than they were losing them. The convoy system ensured that cargo continued to move, and the U-boats, once predators, were becoming prey. Inside the bunkers of Lorient, Brest, and Saint-Nazaire, surviving U-boats limped into port bearing scars of the new reality: depth charge damage, fuel shortages, and crews exhausted by constant air patrols. Repair yards struggled to keep up. Spare parts were limited. Skilled workers were diverted to other fronts. Every submarine returned in worse condition than when it departed. Meanwhile, afloat in the Atlantic, newly built Allied escorts were showing capabilities that shocked German commanders. Long-range radar enabled detection of submarines on the surface at night, once the U-boats' safest time to approach convoys. Ultra-intelligence, derived from decrypted Enigma messages, allowed convoys to avoid wolfpacks entirely. And escort carriers filled the mid-ocean gap, launching aircraft that forced submarines to remain submerged for dangerously long periods, draining their batteries and slowing their attacks. Donitz, a lifelong submariner, recognized the implications immediately. In private, he admitted that the U-boats were being hunted down like animals. Publicly, he urged his crews to adapt, introducing tactics that might improve survival. But even he could not ignore the undeniable truth: the submarine fleet had lost freedom of movement. Germany attempted to counter this crisis with technology. The introduction of the snorkel, allowed submarines to run diesel engines while submerged, reducing exposure on the surface. Work accelerated on the Type XXI Electroboot, a revolutionary design with greater underwater endurance and speed. But these innovations came too late. Allied bombing raids crippled production facilities. Raw materials dwindled. Skilled labor shortages worsened. And through it all, American shipyards continued their relentless work, turning out Liberty ships, Victory ships, escort carriers, destroyer escorts, and tankers at a scale no naval strategist in Germany had believed possible. Throughout 1943, German Naval Command reviewed internal estimates of American capacity. Even the most pessimistic projections underestimated reality. Every time a revised intelligence summary arrived, it brought worse news. More yards opening, production times dropping, launch rates increasing. In July 1943, when the Allies invaded Sicily, they did so with an armada made possible only by the industrial victories of the Atlantic. Germany now confronted a terrifying truth. Its U-boat fleet could no longer influence the pace or direction of the war. The climax of the Battle of the Atlantic, therefore, was not a single battle but a revelation. The realization unfolded slowly across charts, reports, and the wreckage of returning submarines. Germany had lost the ability to control the sea, and with that loss, it forfeited any chance of starving Britain or halting Allied troop movements. By late 1943, U-boat commanders were no longer asking how to win the Atlantic. They were asking how to survive it. Patrols were shorter, successes rarer, losses increasingly severe. The once celebrated wolfpacks dissolved into smaller, more cautious groups, shadows of their former power. Germany had misunderstood the nature of modern warfare. Victory no longer depended solely on brilliance at sea, but on the capacity to replace what was lost. And in that race, the United States had built an engine too vast, too efficient, and too rapid for any submarine fleet to challenge. The industrial triumph unfolding across America's shipyards had transformed the Atlantic from a graveyard of Allied hope into a highway of victory. Supplies flowed, troops moved, and Germany, watching from occupied ports and coastal bunkers, understood that its most feared weapon had been decisively overtaken. This recognition set the stage for the aftermath, a world reshaped by the victory of logistics over attrition, and the beginning of Germany's irreversible decline in the Atlantic War. When historians examine the Battle of the Atlantic, they often point to sonar improvements, radar breakthroughs, ultra-intelligence, and escort carriers as pivotal elements of Allied victory. All were important, but beneath every tactical advancement lay the most decisive factor of all: the overwhelming industrial output of the United States. The aftermath of the 1943 turning point can be understood through a single contrast, one that German commanders struggled to accept even as the data accumulated. Between 1942 and 1943, German U-boats sank roughly 6 million tons of Allied shipping. America built more than 14 million tons of new shipping. The numbers were not simply superior, they were transformative. Every Liberty ship launched did more than replace a loss. It expanded the total carrying capacity of the Allied logistics network. Supply routes to Britain strengthened. The Soviet Union received essential materials through Arctic convoys and the Persian corridor. Allied armies in North Africa, Sicily, and later Italy were supplied with food, ammunition, fuel, and vehicles at a scale impossible only a year earlier. By mid-1943, the tonnage equation, the central metric of the submarine war, had shifted permanently. For every ship the Germans sent to the bottom, the Allies added 2, sometimes 3, and escorted them more effectively than before. German naval staff produced revised estimates, attempting to calculate what level of U-boat efficiency would be required to reverse the trend. The results were chilling. To merely slow Allied logistical growth, U-boat sinkings would need to quadruple. Nothing in Germany's industrial capacity or tactical arsenal could achieve that. A second dimension of the aftermath involved U-boat losses, which were now staggering. In 1943 alone, Germany lost over 250 U-boats, thousands of trained crewmen, and months of construction investment for each vessel. Many losses occurred far from convoy lanes. Aircraft patrolling the Bay of Biscay intercepted submarines attempting to reach open ocean. Anti-submarine groups hunted them with new precision. Mines, patrols, and radar-equipped escorts closed every avenue of escape. The U-boat arm, once the pride of the Kriegsmarine, had become a resource sink. Every submarine lost required 30 to 40 tons of high-grade steel, months of skilled labor, complex manufacturing capacity, and, most critically, crews with years of training. Germany could not replace these components at the pace required for sustained conflict. Meanwhile, American shipyards accelerated. By late 1943, some yards built a Liberty ship every 2 to 3 days. Total merchant tonnage surpassed pre-war global levels. Victory ships, faster, stronger cargo vessels, began replacing earlier designs. Escort carriers provided air cover across previously unreachable distances. The outcome was not merely numerical. It was strategic. Supply routes that had once been under pressure now grew stronger under strain. Countries once on the edge of economic collapse now received more material than they could immediately use. Britain, which had entered 1942 with minimal reserves, ended 1943 with stockpiles large enough to support continued operations across multiple theaters. For Germany, the aftermath brought consequences far beyond the Atlantic. The inability to sever Allied logistics meant the Soviet Union would continue receiving American trucks, locomotives, aircraft, and food. Britain could support large-scale military operations like Operation Overlord. The Mediterranean campaigns would receive uninterrupted fuel and supplies. Strategic bombing of Germany intensified as more aircraft and parts reached Britain. The industrial collapse of the U-boat strategy thus triggered a cascade of defeats across Europe. A weapon designed to starve Britain instead starved Germany of oil, iron, or food imports and strategic opportunity. Every ton of material that crossed the Atlantic weakened the Axis somewhere. Every Liberty ship launched amplified the pressure. Germany had aimed to choke the lifeline of the Allied war effort. Instead, that lifeline became an unstoppable artery, carrying the resources that would ultimately break the back of the Third Reich. The aftermath of 1943 was not merely a shift in momentum. It was the irreversible loss of Germany's last realistic hope for victory in the Atlantic. Now, in the second half of the aftermath, the geopolitical, operational, and psychological consequences of this shift will become even clearer. The collapse of the U-boat campaign in 1943 did not simply protect Allied shipping. It unleashed a chain reaction that reshaped every major theater of World War II. With the Atlantic lifeline secured, the Allies gained the one resource Germany could no longer match: strategic freedom. The first major consequence emerged in the buildup toward Operation Overlord. The invasion of Nazi-occupied Western Europe required an unprecedented level of logistical preparation. Millions of tons of supplies, vehicles, ammunition, rations, medical equipment, fuel, and construction materials had to cross the Atlantic safely before a single soldier stepped onto the beaches of Normandy. Without control of the sea, such a feat would have been impossible. With U-boats pushed back and ship production accelerating, the Allies assembled an invasion force unmatched in modern history. Germany understood this danger. Its high command recognized that Allied material strength was now expanding beyond reach. Lines and reports from 1943 become increasingly stark. Enemy shipping appears unlimited, one read. Another simply stated, losses cannot affect their war potential. Dönitz himself, in later reflections, acknowledged that the failure to cut Britain off from overseas supply denied Germany the chance to force a negotiated peace. A second consequence appeared on the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union, still bearing the brunt of the land war, relied heavily on Lend-Lease shipments arriving through Persian Gulf ports, Arctic convoys, and Far East routes. American trucks, jeeps, locomotives, aircraft, and food kept Soviet armies mobile and fed. Without secure shipping lanes, the Soviet counteroffensive, already straining under enormous logistical burdens, would have been far weaker. Instead, the Red Army grew stronger with each passing month. Germany thus faced a two-front war fueled by an enemy with seemingly unlimited resources. The third consequence occurred in the Mediterranean. With shipping losses falling, the Allies launched and sustained operations in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. Armored divisions received spare parts and replacement vehicles. Air forces received fuel, munitions, and maintenance supplies. The logistics stockpiles for these campaigns would have been impossible without the secure flow of shipping across the Atlantic. The Mediterranean became a proving ground for the industrial momentum that began in American shipyards. The Allies no longer fought with caution born of scarcity. They fought with the confidence of a supply chain that could rebuild and reinforce faster than Germany could respond. A fourth consequence was psychological. Germany's submarine arm had been a symbol of national power, a weapon capable of threatening global supply routes. When that weapon failed, it dealt a profound blow to German morale. Reports from U-boat crews reflect a growing sense of futility. Night approaches once safe now ended in radar detection. Torpedo attacks once executed with confidence now required desperate caution. Survivors describe the transition in simple terms. We were no longer hunters. We were running from the sky. We could not stop the ships. The decline in morale contributed to tactical hesitations and cautious patrols, factors that further reduced U-boat effectiveness. Finally, there was the moral consequence, the realization that the war's outcome had been decided not only by battles, but by the capacity of societies to mobilize. American industry demonstrated that modern warfare could be won by scale, efficiency, and persistence. Liberty ships, though plain and utilitarian, became vessels of survival for Britain, mobility for the Soviet Union, and momentum for Allied armies. By the end of 1944, the Atlantic no longer resembled a battleground. It had become a vast, secure highway of steel, carrying men, equipment, and hope toward the liberation of Europe. Germany's dream of isolating Britain had dissolved beneath the weight of American shipbuilding output. The U-boat fleet continued to fight, but the war it had been designed to win no longer existed. Attrition was now Germany's enemy, not its strategy. Each sinking was a symbolic act, not a strategic victory. In the aftermath, the Battle of the Atlantic stood as one of the clearest demonstrations in history that industrial capacity can be more decisive than firepower. The Allies had not merely survived the submarine threat. They had overwhelmed it with production, adaptation, and innovation. The final reflection of this story lies not in the wreckage beneath the Atlantic waves, but in the lesson the war left behind. In the long view of history, the Battle of the Atlantic is often remembered for its danger, its tension, and its staggering human cost. But beneath the surface of convoy battles and submarine patrols lies a quieter truth, one that shaped the outcome of the entire war. It was not a single weapon or a single breakthrough that secured the Atlantic. It was the ability of a nation to build, replace, and sustain at a pace no enemy could match. America's shipyards did more than produce steel hulls. They produced time, opportunity, and strategic possibility. Every Liberty ship launched was a statement that the Allies would not be starved, cornered, or slowed. Every convoy that reached Britain carried the momentum of a global coalition. Every ton of material arriving safely weakened the Axis somewhere on the map. Germany entered the war believing that courage, tactical brilliance, and technological prowess could overcome material disadvantage. For a time, that belief seemed justified. The U-boats terrified the Atlantic, sank millions of tons of shipping, and brought Britain to the edge of collapse. But the war revealed a deeper principle. Modern conflict is won by the side that can replace what it loses. American workers, welders, machinists, laborers, and volunteers became the quiet architects of victory. Their efforts ensured that the Allied armies fighting in North Africa, Italy, France, and the Pacific never lacked the ships needed to carry their war forward. Their output became the foundation upon which every major offensive of 1943, 1944, and 1945 was built. For Germany, The shock was profound. The belief that submarines could strangle a global superpower collapsed under the weight of an industrial response unlike anything the world had ever seen. The war at sea became a testament to the power of scale and unity, a demonstration that logistics, not headlines, decide the fate of nations. Today, the story of America building ships faster than Germany could sink them stands as one of the clearest examples of how industry shapes history. A reminder that in the vast machinery of world events, the hands that weld steel can be as decisive as the hands that command fleets.